Professor Robert Patman is going to be with us pretty soon. He's an esteemed researcher and lecturer in international relations, global security and US foreign policy. He's authored or edited 12 books, among them New Zealand and the World, Past, Present and Future. And we're going to get him in and talk about Ukraine. And I have to say, as we've been concentrating on issues in New Zealand, somehow, and I guess what we talked about yesterday, my news feed up until the start of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, I was getting thrown Ukraine videos and Ukraine information by the logarithm. And it seems a crazy world we live in, that suddenly a defamation case takes over what is a shooting war, and a war that many are worried might lead to a wider conflict in Europe. Right now, though, we are joined by Professor Robert Patman. Robert, welcome to the program. Nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, good morning, Sean. Good to talk to you.
All right. As I said, I think somehow, in my perception, interest perhaps, or the headline-grabbing nature of the Ukraine war, it's kind of cooled somewhat. It's almost an old news story, but it is still very much a real conflict. Give me an update of where things are at militarily right now.
Well, militarily, we've entered sort of phase 2 of the war. The first phase was the battle for Kiev, which in fact the Russians were defeated in their attempt to overrun the country quickly. And so they've been pushed back to the eastern part of the country, where this is but led to a redefinition of the war's objective by the Putin government. And they said now that they're concentrating on liberating, as they put it, eastern Ukraine, which in fact they've had some sort of presence in eastern Ukraine since 2014, but obviously since the full-scale invasion, much bigger now. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are getting a big infusion of military support from many countries around the world, including the United States. The Americans have just announced a $39 billion package of Lend-Lease. And so I think it's crunch time for Mr. Putin in the next month or so. Some commentators are speaking now of a long war, Sean, that it's going to be a long sort of grinding battle of attrition. I'm not sure about that. I think the momentum is moving now towards the Ukraine. And they've launched a counteroffensive in the last 2 days and reclaimed positions around Kharkiv in the east, the second biggest, most important city after Kiev.
Yeah, but Mariupol has fallen. Odessa is blockaded,
Yes.
so grain can't get out of there. That doesn't sound to me like Ukraine is winning.
Well, given the situation they faced, it's always very difficult to look at a conflict. I mean, this was an invasion, an attempted annexation. And Ukraine still has quite considerable footholds even in the east. And certainly Russia has tremendous advantages in terms of manpower and the size of their army and their military capabilities, but they have lost substantially, probably more than 20,000 troops. They've lost. I mean, Ukraine has stolen or gained 233 battle tanks as a result of this conflict, which is more than the British, for example, have in their entire tank fleet. So it's not going according to plan for Mr. Putin, and the task facing Ukraine is considerable. The Russians have not given up on their goal of liberating or annexing Ukraine, but I think if you look in terms of momentum, I think it's beginning to go towards the Ukrainian side. What was really striking is how the Ukrainian leadership are now redefining the goals towards, as they put it, ejecting all Russian troops from Ukraine, whereas before they were talking about perhaps conceding a bit of territory in the east. But I think that's gone now, particularly after the discovery of how Russia has treated the Ukrainian population in the cities they've occupied.
All right. Does this mean, if you like, the scaling back of Russian success or the lack of Russian success, does that make the entire situation less risky in terms of the conflict spreading or bringing other countries or bringing NATO into this conflict? Has the risk to, if you like, world peace or world stability reduced, or is it still high?
No, I think it's very, very high for several reasons. Firstly, just this ongoing conflict, Sean, has the potential for things to happen inadvertently, a missile to go astray. I mean, for example, if a Russian, mentioned missile strikes on Odessa, if one of those missile strikes goes astray and strikes Poland, then the NATO countries under Article 5 are obliged to react effectively. And that is to say, attack on one is attack against all. So you could have a situation where that happens inadvertently. You could also have a situation where if Mr. Putin loses more ground in the east, and I believe that could happen in the not too distant future, he may be seeking to reverse a declining situation on the military battlefield by bringing out, some weapons of mass destruction. Now, I think he would be very reluctant to do that because China has already indicated there's no circumstances which it would support the tactical use of nuclear weapons or even weapons of mass destruction in the Ukraine. So I think that Russia would realize it would be absolutely isolated. It's already isolated, but it's got a few allies like China. But so there are those possibilities that the thing could escalate even through inadvertent means, or Mr. Putin feeling cornered that he must do something to try to somehow snatch victory from the jaws of perhaps defeat.
I know there was a lot of talk or hope, I guess, that the sanctions and, his crazy behaviour might lead to regime change in Russia. They have certainly clamped down on free speech and media and protest. What feeling are we getting about how the Russian people are regarding the continuing conflict? And is Putin on the verge of being deposed or replaced, or is he simply holding on to power with an iron fist?
Well, he's attempting to hold on to power with an iron fist. But I think, I personally think his days politically are numbered. He needs to have a quick military victory in the east and then consolidate that in order to shore up his position at home. At the moment, the regime is claiming they've only lost 1,300 troops, but Russian families, which are so desperate to find out where all these missing people are now directly contacting people in Ukraine to find out if they have any information about soldiers. So, the estimates vary about the Russians killed, but anywhere, the British put it around about 16, 17,000. The Ukrainians put it much higher, probably 25,000. We don't know the exact figure, but substantial number of Russians have been killed. And we do know in the fighting around the east, with these new weapons arriving from the United States, and as one Russian commentator put it quite bitterly, we're now fighting against NATO's global standard weapons, and we are comparatively under-equipped in comparison. So Mr. Putin has to deal with this. At some point, you can't go on saying night is day. You can't go on saying you've only lost 1,300 when more than 20,000 have died. There's also signs that both the military and the FSB have been quite unhappy. In fact, the FSB has been, 150 of its personnel have been arrested by Putin and blamed for what's gone wrong. But in fact, Mr. Putin got some quite severe warnings before the invasion of Ukraine from senior retired military people in Russia that invading Ukraine would be a catastrophe. So some of them feel quite vindicated in their warnings to Mr. Putin, which of course he ignored. And I do think that the situation for Mr. Putin is much more precarious than many people recognize. And that's understandable, because in an authoritarian regime, and this is an authoritarian regime, a very repressive regime, you don't get any sort of early warning signs when it's in trouble. And we could wake up one day and Mr. Putin have been displaced.
I've been surprised so far that things haven't escalated further. I think we've all been surprised by the resilience of the Ukrainian military. Game this out for me, Robert. What do you think is most, and I'm not going to hold it to you and I'll ask you to put money on it. Where do you think this goes? Does it end quickly? Does it drag on? Does Putin leave? So what's your feeling? What would your prediction be?
Well, the majority opinion is going to grind on for months and perhaps years. I would take a different view. I think that the Ukrainians are now getting the heavy weaponry they wanted for a long time because they proved how resilient and how competent they are on the battlefield. Russia's army has got real problems. They couldn't even feed their own troops in the first few days of the conflict. And they seem to be ill-disciplined and not particularly well-trained. So going forward, I think the momentum is now switching to the Ukrainians, and I think I think the Russian position, I would think, but I don't know, but my intuition tells me that the Russian position could quickly deteriorate within 4 to 6 weeks. And if the Russian position did collapse in the east, I can't see Mr. Putin surviving that.
Wow, what would happen to Russia post-Putin then? Does another oligarch or one of the oligarchs take over? Is it going to be bad fella replaced by another bad fella?
That's quite possible under an authoritarian system, but we also know there's a lot of leaders who've been repressed, such as Navalny, Alexei Navalny, twice poisoned. There are other promising democratic leaders in Russia. And I think one lesson that will come out of it, for anybody who succeeds Putin, that the costs of trying to expand Russia's influence by military force in Eastern Europe and around its neighboring countries is just too great. So at some point, there's going to have to be a big rethink about Russia's foreign policy. The war in Ukraine has been an unmitigated strategic disaster for Russia. Russia's going to be paying a price for a long time. And the other thing, Sean, the reason I'm not confident about the Russian performance in the war is the economy. These sanctions are really hurting. And the Russian economy, was never huge. It was smaller than Italy's, about 11th in the world. It's not a superpower. And, it's now got the collective weight of most developed countries against it in the world. And they're formidable odds. And China, yes, offering rhetorical support, but not much in the way of real large military assistance to the Russian ally.
I made the observation as we started this and earlier in this morning that I think in the public consciousness and the media consciousness, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has in some ways been replaced in terms of media feeds and media coverage by the conflict between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, which is kind of crazy to me. Should we all still remain vitally interested in what is happening on a day-to-day basis in Ukraine?
I think so, but you'd expect someone who teaches and researches international relations to say yes, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But no, putting that my own bias aside, New Zealand has a lot of skin in this game, and we're a liberal democracy. We've witnessed a liberal democracy. An attempted annexation on a liberal democracy by an authoritarian regime, which is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine has given up nuclear weapons and embraces a non-nuclear vision, which we also do. And in addition, we've seen the international rules-based order, or what's left of it, ripped up by Mr. Putin's government. This is a permanent member of the Security Council. And it's effectively ripped up the UN Charter. Now, this is all big concerns to us because we critically depend as a country on an international rules-based order. We're not big enough to make our own rules, Sean, and therefore we need a reasonably stable international framework. We trade with more than 100 countries, and it's very important for a small but active global player like New Zealand that we have a reasonably stable framework which is based on rules rather than raw power.
Do you think we've done enough to support Ukraine, that we've done all we can?
I think we've certainly stepped up our effort. We started off, I think, with about 6 million in humanitarian assistance, and then we added 5 million in non-lethal military assistance, and now we're up to about 30 million. And also we've added to that sanctions as well. So I think we have expanded our effort, and I think there has been a recognition by the Jacinda Ardern government that we have a big stake in the outcome, and the outcome we need is for Mr. Putin to fail in this attempt to annex a neighbor, because if he succeeded, it would not necessarily stop with Ukraine. And what Mr. Putin stands for, of course, those values he represents are completely opposite to the sort of values that New Zealand represents in the world.
I get you completely. Look, just one final question. Is there any chance now of a negotiated peace, of Ukraine and Russia sitting down and saying, let's stop killing each other, let's stop killing civilians, let's work this out?
No, I don't think so. No, I think that's gone. And I think any talk about an off-ramp for Mr. Putin's gone after the appalling behaviour of Russian forces in places like Bucha and Irpin. And I think that possibility is gone. I think the Ukrainians are fully united behind the Zelensky government. They are succeeding. They held off an attempted blitzkrieg of their country. They're now pushing towards the east. They believe that Mr. Putin's in trouble. The Ukrainians, when they're interviewed, do not have they're not complacent, and they respect Russian firepower. But at the same time, they believe they've got the measure of the Russian army. I think that there's not much to negotiate unless Mr. Putin wants to sit down with Mr. Zelensky and arrange the terms of his full withdrawal from the Ukraine.
Robert, that is fantastic. And I feel like actually I don't feel so guilty now for following Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, because you've brought me up to date on what is in reality a far more serious story that is going to have a far greater impact on the world and our lives. I thank you so much for spending the time to talk to us this morning, and we will talk again. That is Professor Robert Patman.